Chapter 25 briefly pauses the ongoing pursuit of David by Saul, which is resumed in chapter 26. A brief note at the beginning states that Samuel has died. Even though all Israel assembled and mourned him, this is passed over quickly, and we have no final testament speech from him like Jacob or Moses. Instead, the narrative moves straight on to this intriguing episode with Nabal and Abigail. It is here that we begin to see something of the potential royalty with David. Although he is still waiting for the Lord to do what he will with Saul, it is in his dealings with the wise Abigail that he starts to act more like a king than a fugitive chieftain. Verses 2 to 3 set the scene. It is a time for celebrating because the sheep were being sheared. The owner's great wealth is described even before giving his name, which emphasizes the meanness of his refusal to come. His name, Nabal, means fool, but this is not likely the name his parents gave him. Either it was given to him by the narrator, or it is a play on his original name. He is further described as a hard man and an evildoer. Abigail, whose name might mean "my father rejoices," is his opposite. She is clever and beautiful. David's appeal during this time of celebration is not simple charity. This is the time when the herdsmen would receive their due, and David tells Nabal he has protected his property. But David is also very friendly and respectful in his message. He begins warmly with a blessing and ends by calling himself Nabal's son, a reverent touch. The food he asks for does not have to be specially prepared. It is all ready for the festival. Nabal's refusal is very rude. He rejects any claim to significance that David might have and implies he is a runaway slave, leading other runaway slaves. David's kindness is ignored entirely. Fortunately, one of Nabal's servants told Abigail what had transpired. He rightly sensed evil has been decided against his master and against all his house, and he thereby saves his own neck, for David had sworn to kill every male. Abigail bursts into action to prevent this disaster. Her bringing of gifts is reminiscent of Jacob pacifying Esau, who was coming to him with an army. But her speech to David is filled with wisdom and humility and is deeply impressive. She begins by bowing face down to the ground and addressing him as Lord. She takes the responsibility on herself, even though she will shortly say she did not know what had happened. She repeatedly calls herself David's servant and agrees Nabal's name is well deserved. But it is in verses 26 to 31 where Abigail gets really clever. She begins to weave an argument around her confidence that God has certainly anointed David king. In verse 26, she implies that her intervention is really the Lord saving David from blood guilt. But nonetheless, David's enemies will be destroyed, and in verse 29, she alludes to his killing of Goliath. But mixed in with this assurance about David's rise to power are three expressions of desire that David not be tainted with sin. The first is in verse 26, the second in 28, and the third in verse 31. She says, in effect, that God has made you king and will establish your house. But because of this, you must be protected from disgrace and sin and blood guilt, including pangs of conscience. Nevertheless, your enemies will be destroyed. She concludes by asking that David remembers his servant Abigail once the Lord has done all this for him. In all this, she frames her very humble intervention as a gift to David, which allows her to ask to be repaid. Thus the tables are turned, and now David is in Nabal's shoes and must decide whether to repay a kind act. David recognizes the truth of this speech and is very grateful. He is kingly in granting her petition, as if hearing it in court. He later marries her once she becomes available. Even though kings married for political reasons, and this did serve that purpose, David marries a beautiful and wise woman. The events of chapter 26 are very similar to those of chapter 24. Again, David stresses the impossibility of harming the Lord's anointed. Where does this deep conviction come from? One gets the impression that David really did love Saul at one point, and whatever his feelings now, he still regards him as untouchable. It is for the Lord to handle. Only the Lord should break what he has made. Yet David will still make a point to Saul about the injustice of the situation. His mercy in sparing Saul, now twice, proves beyond all doubt that he is no threat. This time he also laments and fears that he is in a foreign land and may die in it, cut off from the Lord and Israel. Once again, he ends by pointing out the king wastes his time hunting for a flea. But this time, despite Saul's regret and his call for him to return and calling him my son and his blessing, David no longer trusts him. He tells Saul to send a lad for the spear, and the final words of the story show them parting and going their own ways.